Today, I'm excited to be interviewing Nick McMahon, the founder of Enterprise Asset Solutions, which is an IT asset disposition and recycling company based in Omaha, Nebraska, for viewers who want to take action on their IT asset challenges. What's the best way to get started, and how can they learn more about your services in particular?
The best way to get started, Ken, is anyone interested in learning about what Enterprise Asset Solutions might be able to do for you, visit our website. It's www.easomaha.com. I will say my expertise is hardware and that, not building websites. My website is relatively basic. However, it's also somewhat intentional. And the reason is because I enjoy conversation with people. I believe you can learn more about people and their needs by chatting with them on the phone or face to face.
Yes.
So your basic questions are answered on my website. But if you have complex questions or custom needs that you would like me to tailor a program to you, call, email. We can facilitate a call or a meeting virtually if needed. My contact number is also on the website. You're always more than welcome to reach me directly by phone.
Great.
One of the biggest differences between Enterprise Asset Solutions and other companies is when you pick up a phone and you call me, you don't talk to a robot. You don't talk to an individual that doesn't know the answer to your question. You're talking to the owner. You're talking to, do I always have all the answers? Maybe for your particular situation, no, but I can usually figure it out pretty quick. And so, I even answer the phone on the weekends. I've had customers fill out the form on a Saturday, expecting to hear from me on a Monday or Tuesday, and they get a call within an hour and they're just blown away.
Very cool.
A lot of that just happens to do with the fact that I'm a small company. Earning business is important to me. And so it's kind of one of those things where when you're a small business, you take care of your customers and your community. And due to the size of my company, so I don't have a dedicated massive facility as we've talked about before.
Right.
And I have some clients that prefer to bring their material to me, some business clients that bring their material to me. And I do work with those clients and I do allow them to bring it here. I run by appointment for that reason. And so that it's important that I note that when I do those appointments, I'm very flexible with my appointment times, and I want to work with that client and do what's best for them.
Very good. And remind us, what is your service area overall for Enterprise Asset Solutions?
I cover the Omaha Metro, Council Bluffs, and Lincoln, all the metro areas, usually within 50 miles of those areas.
Okay.
I can go farther, but it's something we definitely have to talk about, negotiate before I can agree to. I just have to make sure that it is something that would fit within my operational abilities.
Very good.
And such. I do have one thing I want to touch on too.
Yeah, please.
And really reinforce. One of my biggest core values is giving back to the community that I operate in. And this is done in various ways, maybe community recycling events, donations, event sponsorships, affordable pricing on quality used equipment for nonprofits. I've worked with a couple nonprofits recently on providing them affordable technology upgrades.
Yes.
And then I have a referral program too. Anybody that refers me to a business that might be needing my services, I give you $100 cash in your pocket just for your referral. As long as that turns into an agreement with that business, I'll give you $100 cash. But you remember, I like supporting local business too. So I sweeten the pot a little bit. If somebody is willing to get a gift card instead of cash, I'll give them a $125 gift card, but it has to be to a local business. That's something that will always be important to me, is supporting local and supporting our community. And I've done some recycling events with churches where I contribute a portion of the proceeds back to the church as well. It's something I'm proud of and like to do. And it's just a good environmental thing to do.
It's a computer recycling day sponsored by a local entity, usually a nonprofit. That's cool. That is very cool.